She stood in the kitchen I built for her mother and told me I was no longer capable of living alone. My daughter-in-law, with her French manicure and her voice like a smile stretched too tight, handed me a pamphlet for a senior living community in Scottsdale and told me I should be grateful they were here to help. My son stood behind her, nodding, not looking at me. She had no idea the man she was trying to move into assisted living had quietly sold 2 medical patents the previous spring for $38 million. And she had absolutely no idea that the house she was already measuring for new curtains wasn't hers. It had never been hers. I just folded the pamphlet in half, slid it into my shirt pocket, and said, "Let me think about it." She smiled like she had already won. "Thank you for being here. Before I go any further, if this story means something to you, hit like and subscribe and leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know just how far a father's voice can travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Robert. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon at a hospital outside of Austin, Texas. I opened chests for a living. I held beating hearts in my hands. I have steady nerves. I say this not to brag, but because it matters. What came next required every bit of steadiness I had ever built. My wife, Carol, passed away 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the morning. I sat beside her in the quiet of our bedroom and held her hand until she stopped breathing. She was the architecture of everything I built. The ranch, the gardens, the life we made here in the Texas Hill Country. It was all her idea, and I just had the sense to say yes to every single one. We had 2 children. My daughter Claire is 41. She lives in Portland with her husband and her 2 kids and calls me every Sunday without fail. She is her mother's daughter. Good instincts. Honest to a fault. She is not part of this story in any harmful way, which is a grace I am still grateful for. My son Marcus is 38. He is smart in the way that a person can be smart without ever actually learning anything. He married my daughter-in-law 6 years ago, and from the beginning, something in the back of my mind registered a quiet warning I chose to ignore. I was wrong to ignore it. That is a thing I have had to sit with. My daughter-in-law grew up in a suburb of Dallas and had, from what I could observe, spent her entire adult life calculating the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be. She was charming in the way that a locked door can be charming, perfectly finished on the outside, with no intention of ever actually letting you in. She called me Dad from the very first Thanksgiving. It always felt like a key being tested in a lock. They had been living in a condo in Houston. Marcus worked in commercial real estate, which meant he knew the value of everything and the cost of very little. My daughter-in-law did not work, which she described as a lifestyle choice and which I understood to be a strategy. They arrived on a Saturday in October, just as the live oaks were turning. They said they were coming for a long weekend. They brought 4 suitcases. I should have counted the suitcases. They were through the front door before I had finished making coffee. My daughter-in-law walked through the house with her eyes moving like an appraiser's landing on Carol's antique mirror in the entryway, sweeping across the open living room with its limestone fireplace, pausing at the wall of windows that looks out over 63 acres of cedar and open sky. She pressed one hand to the glass and let out a long breath. "Robert," she said, using my name instead of Dad for the first time in 6 years. "This place is absolutely wasted on just one person." I looked at my son. He was looking at his phone. Over dinner that night, they laid it out. They were going to stay. Not for a weekend. Indefinitely. They framed it as concern. Marcus said I had been isolated. That a man my age shouldn't be rattling around alone on a 63-acre property with no one to check on him. My daughter-in-law said she had been reading about age-related cognitive changes and how important it was for older adults to have support structures. She said the word cognitive the way someone says it when they want you to hear the word dementia without them having to say it out loud. I asked what had changed. My son said nothing had changed. They were just worried. I noticed they had already moved their toiletries into the master bath down the hall. I said, "It's good to have family close." I meant it to be warm. I think they heard it as surrender. Within 2 weeks, my daughter-in-law had replaced Carol's flower arrangements with something she described as cleaner. She had a conversation with our landscaper that I was not part of, and 2 of Carol's rose beds were cleared to extend the back patio. I stood at the window and watched them pull those bushes out. I didn't say anything. I just went to my study and closed the door. My son started talking about the ranch the way my daughter-in-law talked about the house as a resource. He mentioned, twice, that the back 40 acres were sitting unproductive and that a friend of his had connections to a luxury residential developer. He said the timing was good. He said the market was strong. He said, "Dad, you have to think about liquidity." I said I'd think about it. I was thinking about a great many things he wasn't aware of. The conversation I had been dreading came on a Tuesday morning. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee and the newspaper, an actual newspaper, which my daughter-in-law had twice referred to as quaint. My son sat down across from me. My daughter-in-law stood at the counter, which is where she went when she wanted to appear casual about something she had already rehearsed. My son said he had been speaking with an attorney. He said there was a document called a durable power of attorney that would allow him to help manage my affairs. Just as a precaution, he said, just so there was someone who could act quickly if something ever happened to me. He slid a folder across the table. I opened it. I read the first page. It was not a precaution. It was a transfer. The document, if I signed it, would give my son legal authority over every financial and medical decision in my life, every account, every asset, every choice. I looked at my son. I said, "Where did you get this?" He said a friend had helped him put it together. I said, "This friend is a lawyer?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Tell me something, Marcus. When did you last get my mail?" He looked confused. He said he had been picking it up, just to help out. I nodded. I closed the folder. I said, "Let me read this more carefully before I sign anything." I smiled at him. "I just want to make sure I understand what I'm agreeing to." He looked relieved. My daughter-in-law from the counter made a small, satisfied sound. I took the folder to my study, and I closed the door, and I sat in the chair where I have made every serious decision of my adult life, and I thought about Carol. I thought about what she would say. I knew exactly what she would say. She would say, "Robert, you raised him." But she raised herself to him, and that is not the same thing. I picked up my phone and I called my attorney. His name is Thomas. We have known each other for 22 years. He is the kind of man who does not express alarm, but who you can hear thinking very quickly in the silences between sentences. I told him what the folder said. I told him what the past 3 weeks had looked like. I told him about the rose beds. There was one of those silences. Then Thomas said, "Robert, do you want to simply make this stop, or do you want to do this correctly?" I said, "Thomas, I spent 30 years doing things correctly." He said, "All right. Then here's what we're going to do. I want you to understand something about the next part of what I'm going to tell you. I am not a cruel man. I did not go home that night and celebrate. I sat in my study until the house was quiet, and I looked at the photograph of Carol on my desk, the one from our trip to Colorado, the summer before she got sick, her hair full of wind, laughing at something I had said, and I felt a grief so complete it had no edges. My son had signed his name to a document designed to take my life out of my own hands. My daughter-in-law had given him the pen. I did not do what came next out of revenge. I did it out of something older and quieter. I did it because order has to mean something. Because a man who built something with his hands and his years has the right to decide what happens to it. I did it because Carol's rosebeds were gone, and someone had to answer for that. By morning, the ranch was under contract. Thomas had a developer on file who had been calling about this property for 4 years. A man who builds high-end sustainable communities and who had wanted these 63 acres badly enough to have made 3 separate unsolicited offers over the last decade. Thomas called him at 7 in the evening. By 10 o'clock at night, we had a verbal agreement. By 6 the next morning, the paperwork was signed and the wire transfer was initiated. The price was $4.1 million, which was $200,000 below what Thomas believed I could have gotten if I had taken my time. We did not take our time. Speed was the point. I also made one other phone call that night. Thomas managed several of my assets through a holding company I had established years ago. a company my son knew existed in the same way he knew I had once played piano, vaguely, unimportantly, as a fact about someone else's life. The holding company owned, among other things, a property in Austin, a townhouse in a neighborhood called Tarrytown, 4 blocks from a park, with a small garden out back that Carol had helped me plant. It was a beautiful piece of property. My son and daughter-in-law had been living in it rent-free for the past 2 years, since their Houston condo had become financially complicated. I had offered it to them as a place to land while they sorted things out. I had been very clear, at the time, that it was mine. They had nodded as if I had said something charming and irrelevant. Thomas called his associate in Austin that same evening. By 7 the next morning, a process server was in her car outside that townhouse. I slept better than I had in 3 weeks. They came downstairs at 8:30. My daughter-in-law first, in her silk robe, reaching for the coffee I had already made. My son behind her, checking his phone. The morning was warm and bright. Through the windows you could see the hill country spread out gold and green under the October sun. My daughter-in-law poured her coffee and looked at me with that particular softness she deployed when she wanted something. "Robert," she said, "have you had a chance to look at that paperwork?" I said I had. She said, "And?" I said, "I have a few questions for Thomas. I'm meeting with him this afternoon." My son looked up from his phone. "Oh," he said, sounding careful. "We can come with you, if you want. For support." I said, "That wouldn't be necessary." My daughter-in-law smiled and sipped her coffee. My son's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face did something I had not seen it do before, a quick, involuntary flinch, like a man who hears a sound he doesn't recognize and doesn't like. He answered it. I listened to his side of the conversation. "What? What do you mean? Who?" And then, "That's not what address? No, that's we live there. That's not possible." He hung up and looked at my daughter-in-law. "Someone's at the Tarrytown house," he said, serving papers. She put down her coffee. The softness left her face like water leaving a glass. I looked at my newspaper. They were both looking at me. "Robert," my daughter-in-law said, and her voice had lost every single one of its warm registers. "What did you do?" I turned a page. "I'm not sure what you mean," my son said. "Dad, the house in Tarrytown. What's happening?" I said. "You should probably drive over there." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he grabbed his keys from the counter and they both went out the door. And I sat at the kitchen table in the house I had built and drank my coffee and listened to the cedar birds outside and breathed. I want to tell you what Thomas pieced together from what happened next, and from what came out over the following days. They drove to Tarrytown in separate cars, because by that point they were already not speaking. My daughter-in-law got there first. The process server had already left, but had slid an envelope through the mail slot. She tore it open on the front steps. It was a notice to vacate, issued by the legal owner of the property, my holding company, citing termination of at-will tenancy, effective in 48 hours. My son arrived 3 minutes later. He read the notice over her shoulder. He went inside and began tearing through the filing cabinet in the second bedroom, which is where he kept what he believed were the ownership documents for the property. He found them. He spread them on the kitchen table. They were not ownership documents. They were a lease. They were a 10-page at-will lease agreement signed by both of them 18 months prior on the occasion of their moving in. It had been presented to them by Thomas's associate as standard tenancy paperwork for tax purposes, since the property was held in a corporate structure. My daughter-in-law had signed it in 40 seconds. My son had not read past the first page. If they had read it, they would have noticed that the lease term was at will, terminable by the landlord without cause. They would have noticed the landlord was my holding company. They would have noticed they were described, throughout, as tenants. They had been renting from me for 18 months. The monthly amount, drawn from an account I had set up to transfer automatically, was $800, which they had always assumed was some kind of property management fee. It was rent. My daughter-in-law made a sound my son later described to Thomas when he came to Thomas's office looking for some kind of legal foothold, as a sound I have never heard a human being make. She dropped the lease on the table and she walked to the window. and she stood there for a very long time without speaking. Then she said, "He did this on purpose." My son said, "Brittany." She turned around and her face was something my son had never seen before and something I don't think he'll ever forget. "Don't you dare," she said. "Don't you dare say he didn't know what he was doing. He has been waiting. He has been waiting for us to do this, and he has been waiting to do that." My son did not say anything. She sat down at the kitchen table and picked up her phone and started calling attorneys. No one would take the case. Thomas has a certain reputation in Austin, and by extension, so do the people whose documents he executes. But my daughter-in-law called 6 firms in 2 hours, and each of them told her, in various registers of professional politeness, that there was no case here. The lease was valid. The tenancy termination was valid. Power of attorney she had helped draft for my son was not yet signed, and therefore not actionable. She had nothing. At some point in the afternoon, my son called me. I let it ring. He called 3 more times. He sent a text that said, "Dad, please call me. This is getting out of hand. Can we just talk?" I was, at that moment, sitting in Thomas's conference room. It was a quiet room on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and through the windows, you could see 6th Street laid out below, like a map of the city's younger self. Thomas had set a cup of coffee in front of me and was reviewing the closing documents for the ranch sale. Everything had moved through cleanly. The wire had cleared. The ranch, which my daughter-in-law had been measuring for new curtains and better furniture and a fire pit that would impress her friends, belonged to someone else. "The developer has a crew starting surveys next week," Thomas said. I nodded. He looked at me. "Are you all right?" I thought about that. I said, "I'm not sure all right is quite the right word." I looked at my coffee. She pulled Carol's roses out. "Thomas." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know," I said. "I want to see them before we close this out." He knew what I meant. The week before, at my instruction, he had sent someone to document the condition of the property, the rose beds, the cleared areas, the changes to the guest room, which had been turned into what my daughter-in-law described as a home office, and which now contained a whiteboard covered in what appeared to be a timeline for some kind of estate planning that did not include my participation. It was all documented. We met 3 days later. I had asked Thomas to set the meeting at his office, and I dressed the way I had dressed for every significant moment in my professional life. Completely, carefully, without hurry. Not a costume, just the version of myself I had earned the right to be. My son came in first. He had aged in 3 days in the way that a man can age when the ground he was standing on turns out to be something else. He sat down at the far end of the table and did not look at me directly. He looked like a man who had practiced what he was going to say and had forgotten all of it. My daughter-in-law came in behind him. "I want to tell you about her face, because I think it's important." The calculation was still there, it never fully left. I don't think it was capable of leaving, but it was running on something close to empty. She was dressed sharply, because she would always dress sharply, but the performance underneath the clothes had stopped. She looked at me, and for just a moment I saw something I had never seen from her before. She looked afraid. Thomas opened a binder on the table. He did not offer pleasantries. "We're here today," he said, "because my client, Robert, felt that you deserved a direct conversation before the formal proceedings concluded. This is not a negotiation." He let that settle. "You are here to listen and to receive certain information, after which my client may choose to speak. Is that understood?" My son said yes. My daughter-in-law said nothing. Thomas laid it out methodically, the way a good surgeon lays out instruments, nothing wasted, everything exactly where it needs to be. He walked them through the ranch sale. He walked them through the Tarrytown lease and its legal standing. He walked them through the power of attorney document, and then he placed the relevant section of Texas law next to it, the section that describes what it means to file a fraudulent legal instrument designed to give a third party control over an elder's assets. He did not call it what it was, not explicitly. He didn't have to. My son's face did the work for him. Then Thomas slid a second folder across the table. He tapped it once. "My client also asked me to address the matter of your finances," he said, looking at my daughter-in-law. She stiffened. Specifically, Thomas said, the financial arrangement that has existed between my client's holding company and your joint accounts for the past 19 months. He opened the folder. During this period, my client has paid, either directly or through corporate subsidy, the following: your rent in Tarrytown, 100% of the utilities on that property, your vehicle's insurance and registration, and a monthly transfer to your joint checking account of $3,000, which you appear to have classified in your own financial records as an inheritance advance. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth. Thomas held up one hand. She closed it. This was not an inheritance advance, Thomas said. There is no document describing it as such. There is no inheritance arrangement of any kind. These were voluntary transfers from my client, which he is under no legal or moral obligation to continue, and which have been stopped as of this week. He closed the folder. The total you have received over 19 months, through these various channels, is in excess of $90,000. My client does not intend to seek recovery of these funds. He is noting them only to ensure that we all have a shared and accurate understanding of the situation. My son put his head in his hands. My daughter-in-law sat very still. She had the look of a person doing rapid arithmetic in a subject she had always assumed she was excellent at. Thomas looked at me. I nodded. I had not spoken yet. I took a moment. I have held a beating heart in my hands. I know what it feels like to have everything depend on steadiness. I looked at my son first. Marcus, I said. He lifted his head. His eyes were red. I have been your father for 38 years. I paid for your education. I co-signed your first mortgage. When your condo went sideways, I gave you somewhere to go. I asked for nothing, except the basic courtesy of being treated like a man who still has his mind. He started to say something. I said, "Let me finish." He was quiet. You sat across from me at the table your mother bought, and you slid a piece of paper at me that would have taken away my legal right to make decisions about my own life. And you sat there nodding while your wife told me what a senior living pamphlet looks like. I paused. I want you to understand that I know you are not entirely responsible for this. I know that. But I also need you to understand that you are not entirely absolved by it either. You are 38 years old. You nodded. That was a choice. He didn't speak. He just looked at the table. I turned to my daughter-in-law. She met my eyes. I will give her that. Whatever she was not a coward in the direct sense. I'm not going to catalog what you did, I said. You know what you did. You came into this family with a plan, and you were patient with it. And in a different life, in a situation involving someone less fortunate than me, it might have worked. I let that settle. I want to ask you one question, and I'd like an honest answer. She waited. Did you ever, I said, actually think about what would happen to me? Not the money, not the property. Me, a 67-year-old man who just lost his wife. Did that enter into any of it? There was a long silence. She looked at the table. For just a moment, something moved across her face that I couldn't categorize. It might have been shame. I've seen enough human faces in enough serious moments to know that shame is not always nothing, she said quietly. I thought you'd be fine, I said. I know. I stood up. Thomas stood with me. The ranch closing is complete, I said. The Tarrytown property will be listed for sale next month. You have 48 hours remaining on your notice to vacate. Thomas will provide you with written confirmation of all outstanding financial matters. I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. I want you to know that I am not doing this out of anger. I am doing this because the alternative was to spend the last years of my life as a piece of furniture in my own home, and I would rather be alone in a hotel room than managed by people who see me as an asset. My son finally looked up. His voice was very small. "Dad," he said, "where are you going to go?" I looked at him for a long time. "I'm going to go somewhere. Carol always wanted to take me," I said. She had a whole list. I ignored most of it, because I was always too busy. I put on my jacket. I'm not too busy anymore. I walked to the door. I stopped with my hand on the frame. I turned back once. "Marcus," I said, "call your sister. She's been worried about you for longer than you know, and she is a better person than either of us deserved." I left them there. in Thomas's conference room, in the wreckage of a plan that had always been, at its core, an insult to the memory of a woman who loved them anyway. Here is what I need to tell you about the weeks that followed, because I think it is the most important part. I am not a man who enjoys suffering mine or anyone else's. I spent 30 years trying to prevent it. I did not leave that conference room feeling victorious. I left it feeling something closer to exhausted and something closer to sad. My son and my daughter-in-law found a short-term rental in Houston. They are, from what Claire tells me, going through a process that looks a great deal like reckoning with each other, with what they did, with what it cost them. I don't know where that ends. I can't predict that. I can only tell you that I hope my son finds his way to the man he is capable of being, because I have always believed he was capable of being a better one than he showed me this fall. And I need to tell you the thing I said in that room that was hardest to say, and that I have thought about the most since. I said, I know you are not entirely responsible. I meant that, because somewhere in the back of my honest mind I know that I made mistakes as a father. I gave freely and without conditions, and I think sometimes I confused generosity with love. And in doing that, I accidentally taught my son that resources arrive without effort and can be taken without cost. That is on me. I own it. If I had asked more of him, not money, not achievement, just responsibility, just accountability, maybe we don't end up in Thomas's conference room. I am 67 years old. I am still learning. I am writing this from a small hotel on the Amalfi Coast. Carol had a photograph of this coastline on the wall of her office for 11 years. She tore it out of a travel magazine in 1998 and had it framed, and every time I asked her when we were going, she'd say, "When you slow down, Robert." I never slowed down in time. She left before I did, so I came without her. I brought the Colorado photograph. I sat on the terrace the first morning with my coffee and the light on the water, and I said out loud, quietly, the way a man speaks when he's alone and talking to someone who isn't there, "I made it. Carol, I'm sorry it took me so long." I don't know if she heard me, but the coffee was very good. And the light on the water was exactly what it looks like in the photograph she cut from a magazine 26 years ago. And I had the whole morning, and the one after that, and the one after that. No one was measuring my house for new furniture. No one was asking me to sign anything. No one was looking at me and calculating. I was just an old man on a terrace in the sun, with his whole life accounted for and nowhere he needed to be. Maybe that is what winning looks like. I'm not entirely sure. I spent so long being busy, I forgot to figure it out. What I know is this: a man who builds something with 60 years of work and discipline and love has the right to decide what it means and where it goes. He doesn't owe anyone a graceful decline. He doesn't owe the people who underestimate him the satisfaction of being right. He owes his wife's memory the dignity of not being erased. And he owes himself, at 67, one honest morning on a terrace in the sun with no one asking him for anything. I'll be home in the spring. I haven't decided where home is yet. That feels like something to figure out slowly. Tell me in the comments, do you think I handled it right? Or did I go too far? There are no easy answers in a family, and I know that. But I'd like to know what you think. And if you've lived through something like this, I'd like to know that too. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. This story isn't over, and neither is mine.